It was supposed to be a small, quiet gesture. I got off work early, stopped by the bakery she liked, picked up her favorite red velvet cake, and cooked dinner. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet moment to celebrate her birthday. A small effort to say, I'm thinking of you. When she walked through the door, I was standing by the kitchen island. Candlelight flickering, food still warm. She barely glanced at it. Instead, she tossed her bag on the counter and said with a smirk, "This is it. I mean, this is the bare minimum, right?" She wasn't angry. She wasn't teasing. She was dead serious, like I had just handed her a participation trophy in a marriage Olympics where she expected gold. I laughed. At first, a small, awkward chuckle. I thought it'd be a nice surprise, I said, trying to keep my voice light. She shrugged. I guess I just expected more. I mean, you cooked dinner and bought cake. Great. But every man does that. It's the bare minimum. That was the moment something inside me didn't just break. It shut off. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw the cake or storm out like in the movies. I just stood there, still. There's a very specific silence that happens when a man realizes he's no longer seen. Not valued, not admired, just expected to show up and perform. And when you're only appreciated for the function you serve, like a faucet that brings water or a car that starts every morning, then one day when you don't, no one notices. They just complain that something's broken. That night, I cleaned up the kitchen by myself. She scrolled her phone on the couch, half watching TV, never mentioning the cake again. No kiss goodnight, no thank you, not even a glance. But I wasn't mad. I wasn't even hurt. I was just quiet. And in that silence, I realized something. Not all betrayals come with lies or infidelity. Some of them arrive slowly, dressed as dismissiveness. Some arrive as the woman you love calling your heart the bare minimum. In the days that followed her comment, I didn't speak much. Not because I was giving her the silent treatment, but because I genuinely had nothing left to say. You can only repeat "I love you" so many times to someone who doesn't say it back. You can only give so much of yourself before you start feeling like a ghost in your own home. She didn't notice my silence. She mistook it for me being moody. She thought it would pass like a cloud drifting through. But it wasn't a phase. It was the beginning of a decision. I started to watch her, not with affection, but with curiosity. The kind of curiosity you have when you realize you've been living next to a stranger for years. I noticed how her eyes lit up when she was texting. Not with me, someone else. I noticed how she laughed more in group chats than at our dinner table. How she got dressed up to go out with her coworkers, but wore old sweats around me. And most of all, I noticed how she had stopped asking anything about my day. Stopped checking in. Stopped even pretending to care. That's when I started taking inventory. Not of what I had done wrong, but of what I had given. I had skipped guy trips to stay home with her. I had worked overtime to pay for her grad school while she figured herself out. I had stood by her during her depressive spells, made excuses to her boss, covered bills when she quit jobs without notice. I had cooked, cleaned, stayed up late to listen to her vent. I gave her my shoulders to cry on, hands to build with, heart to lean into. And now the same hands she used to hold while saying forever, she couldn't even acknowledge for a birthday dinner. She said what I did was the bare minimum, so I gave her exactly that. Nothing at all. No more random flowers on Mondays, no more back rubs after her long shifts, no more jumping in the car when she texted, "Can you grab almond milk?" No more, "I got this" when the bills were tight. No more listening to her vent until midnight when I had a 6 a.m. meeting. I wasn't cruel. I didn't yell. I didn't slam doors. I just stopped being her crutch. At first, she didn't even flinch. It's amazing how used to neglect people get when they're the ones doing the neglecting. But eventually, the silence got to her. She started to poke. "Is something wrong with you lately? You're acting weird. Why are you so quiet?" I would just shrug, smile politely, say I was tired. Tired? Oh, yeah. Tired of being the only one trying. It wasn't until week 2 that she felt the shift. I came home late. I didn't text. She was already in bed scrolling through Instagram. Where were you? She asked. Just out, I said. With who? Friends, I replied and walked into the bathroom. It was subtle, but her body language changed. For the first time in years, she was the one noticing my absence. The irony? I wasn't doing anything shady. I wasn't cheating. I wasn't hiding. I was just reclaiming the space I had once given up trying to be her everything. I was finding myself again, the version of me before her, the version who laughed, who had friends, who wasn't always apologizing for being too much or not enough. That night I slept like a rock, and for the first time in forever, I didn't dream of her. Absence doesn't scream. It doesn't slam doors or demand to be noticed, but it lingers. It grows roots in the spaces between words, settles deep into the fibers of the couch, and hums in the quiet between footsteps. My silence had become its own language, one she never learned to understand. I didn't start with the intention of retreating. It began like erosion, slow, quiet, invisible at first, until you realize the foundation is no longer where you left it. I used to rush to fill every silence with effort, apologies, or reassurance. Now I let the silence expand. I let her feel what I had carried for years, the invisible weight of trying alone. She still hadn't apologized. That fact used to bruise me. Now it simply registered like a note in the background. I wasn't angry. I was just finished expecting what was never offered freely. I had trained myself for years to find joy in crumbs, but I had lost the appetite for that kind of survival. I began waking earlier, before her, before the noise, before the need to explain. I would sit by the window with a cup of black coffee, watching the sun peel back the darkness. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't write long messages to try and feel seen. I just sat, with the quiet, with my thoughts, with the strange comfort of solitude. It was the most honest relationship I'd had in months. She started to notice, not immediately, but in glances. Her eyes lingered longer. Her voice hesitated more. She'd ask if I was okay, not with concern but suspicion, as if my peace had become threatening. I'd smile, nod, and return to whatever I was doing. There was nothing left I needed from her. One night she commented, "You've been really distant." I looked up from my book and met her gaze with an even tone. "Just quieter," I said. "There's a difference." She didn't reply. Maybe she couldn't. Or maybe for the first time, she realized I wasn't waiting for her response anymore. Routine became my sanctuary. I cooked for one, cleaned my side of the sink, made my bed, not to prove a point, but because I realized how much of my life had been shaped around someone who rarely showed up. The more I reclaimed the small rituals of my day, the more I remembered what it felt like to be a man who didn't need validation to feel whole. The house began to feel like a museum of forgotten intentions. Picture frames gathered dust. Her laughter no longer echoed in the hallways. Instead, there was a sharp stillness, the kind that follows after a storm, when you realize the damage wasn't sudden, just long ignored. One evening I made dinner, just for me. I plated it carefully, sat alone at the table, and ate without background noise. When she came home and saw one plate, one chair, one quiet dinner for one, she paused. "You didn't make me any?" she asked. I didn't look up. "No," I answered. The silence that followed said everything I didn't need to explain. 3 days later, she folded my laundry. It was the first act of unsolicited care in months. Neatly stacked, no comment, no acknowledgement, as if hoping the gesture would speak what she couldn't bring herself to say. I saw it, I didn't ignore it, but I didn't reward it either, because love shouldn't feel like feeding breadcrumbs to a starving man. I didn't need an apology wrapped in chores. I needed partnership. That's what I had wanted. Not perfection, not gifts, just presence. But now the realization had settled deeper. You cannot teach someone to value what they never intended to cherish. My father once told me, you can't beg someone to treat you like a priority while they're busy proving you're an option. I didn't understand it then. I do now. The strangest part of detaching is the peace, not the fireworks of defiance, not the satisfaction of revenge, but the soft, grounded stillness of no longer needing to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. One night, brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, not from age, but from carrying the emotional labor of two people. And yet, behind the tired eyes, there was something new. Stillness, strength, something I thought I had lost. She watched me differently now, like she didn't quite recognize me, because I wasn't reacting the way I used to. I wasn't fighting. I wasn't chasing. I wasn't staying to fix it. I was simply leaving, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, step by quiet step. I didn't leave the house, but I had left the relationship, and she felt it. She began to reach for little ways to reconnect, making coffee, asking questions she never cared to ask before, but I let her efforts float unanswered, like letters never opened. I wasn't being cruel. I was being clear. For once, she would have to wonder. For once, I wouldn't make it easy to win me back without the work. The absence was now hers to carry. And in that void, I found something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Power, peace, and most of all, clarity. The first crack came not with a shout, but with a whisper. It was late, that liminal hour between silence and sleep, when she stood in the doorway of the guest room, her frame outlined by the hallway's half-light. For weeks, we had lived like two ghosts haunting the same house. But that night, she wasn't translucent. She was trembling. Real. Finally. "I made tea," she said, holding the cup like an offering. "Chamomile. You always said it helped you think." I didn't reach for it. I didn't smile. I didn't wound her either. I simply nodded, acknowledging the gesture, nothing more. There's a particular kind of silence that forms not from coldness, but from dignity. It's the kind of quiet that doesn't beg for recognition. It allows the other person to sit with their own echoes. The words they've hurled, the warmth they've withheld, the nights they let distance settle like dust on love's mantle. She placed the tea on the table by the door and lingered a beat too long, as if hoping I'd say something. Anything. I didn't. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I had finally run out of explanations to give. Some apologies, once overdue, arrive as hollow as the promises that preceded them. She left without another word. The tea cooled untouched. In the days that followed, I noticed her moving slower, as if the realization of my absence, emotional and spiritual, had finally begun to calcify into something heavier. She wasn't used to uncertainty. For so long, I had been the constant, the compass, the cushion. Now I was gravity, silent and indifferent, yet unyielding. There's something profoundly human about watching someone confront the mirror they've ignored. She began speaking more, not in anger, but in soft, searching sentences. She asked about my work, my family, even my sleep. I answered sparingly, honestly. I offered no venom, no warmth, just presence, grounded in a calm that confused her. One evening, she asked if I still loved her. It was the first honest question she'd asked me in months. And the truth? I didn't know anymore. Love had become a memory of something we used to carry together. Now it was a rope I had worn raw, alone, trying to pull us back from the edge while she watched from the shore. "I loved who we were," I said quietly. "I loved the version of you that loved me back." Her eyes shimmered, not with tears yet, but with the weight of hindsight. She had not expected honesty. She had expected punishment, or perhaps another attempt at saving her from herself. Instead, I gave her truth. Clean, unadorned, unflinching. Days passed. Then came the apology. It wasn't in the form of flowers or dinner or some grand emotional gesture. It came one morning as I was getting ready for work. She stood in the hallway barefoot, wrapped in the old gray cardigan I used to wear when we still laughed over pancakes. "I was cruel," she said, dismissive, ungrateful. "I don't even know when I started treating you like something disposable." I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. This wasn't for me. This was her reckoning. "You used to ask me about my dreams," she continued, voice cracking, "and I gave you sarcasm. You wanted time, and I gave you rules. You offered grace, and I offered games." Her voice broke there. Still, I said nothing. She looked at me with the weight of years in her gaze. I don't know if I can fix this. You can't fix a vase by gluing the pieces back together. You make a new one from the clay of what you've learned. But some people never learn, and some vessels were only meant to be held, not kept. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she added, her voice barely audible. I just needed you to know. I see it now. Everything you carried, everything I dismissed. And in that moment I saw her, really saw her, not as the woman who had hurt me, but as a human being who had failed to love properly and now stood at the threshold of regret. The kind that changes you if you let it. But change is not owed, and healing is not a shared journey when only one person is still bleeding. That night, I took a walk alone through our neighborhood. The streets were quiet, and the moon cast shadows that reminded me of who I had been. The man who waited for permission to be valued. That man was gone, and in his place stood someone slower to speak, harder to shake, but infinitely more at peace. When I returned, the house felt still, not hostile, not hopeful, just still. She was already in bed, lights off, no expectation of my presence, and for once I appreciated the absence of performance. I slept in the guest room again, because some things shouldn't be rushed. Not pain, not forgiveness, and certainly not restoration. In the mornings that followed, she stopped trying to mend things with gestures. Instead, she began repairing herself, quietly. I'd catch her reading in the early hours, journaling, even calling her mother, whom she hadn't spoken to in months. Her questions became softer, her presence less defensive. Still, I kept my distance, not from spite, but from wisdom. When you've spent years walking barefoot on broken glass, you don't run the moment the floor looks clean. You wait. You test each step. And even then, sometimes you choose a different path entirely. I wasn't sure what our future held. I didn't need to be. The power wasn't in certainty. It was in choice. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't making choices out of fear of loss. I was choosing what nourished me, what respected me, what mirrored back the same level of commitment I gave. Maybe we would rebuild. Maybe we wouldn't. But I had already reclaimed the most important thing I had ever lost, myself. There comes a moment, subtle, unceremonious, when you realize that the waiting is no longer about hope, but habit. The guest room had begun to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a place that understood me. The bed didn't creak with resentment. The walls didn't remember past arguments. It simply allowed me to be. And that permission, silent and steady, taught me something I hadn't known how to articulate before. Some spaces are kinder than people. By then, the house had adopted a rhythm of detached civility. She no longer hovered in the hallway, no more teacups, no attempts to initiate conversations. And strangely, her silence wasn't cold anymore. It was surrendered. She had stopped trying to win me back. And maybe that was the kindest thing she could have done. There's this thing no one tells you about reconciliation. It's not always about love. Sometimes it's about power. Sometimes it's about ego. But when you take all of that away, what remains is truth. And truth in its naked form doesn't beg. It just exists. Quiet. Undeniable. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hopeful. I was simply awake. The way someone feels after a long illness, aware of every breath, every ache, every step. One Sunday morning, she sat across from me at the kitchen table. No makeup, no armor, just her. She looked older, not aged, but weathered by the weight of her own choices. I'm seeing a therapist, she said quietly. Not for us, for me. I nodded. It was the right reason, the only one that mattered now. There was a pause, not tense, but necessary. I'm not asking for you to come back, she added, voice measured. I just want you to know. I see it now. All of it. And I understand why you left, even if you're still here. For a moment I studied her, not as a partner, not as a wife, but as a human being. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't see her as the woman who hurt me. I saw her as the woman who was finally hurting herself for what she had become. Pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits across from you, whispering apologies between breaths. I stood, rinsed my coffee mug, and said, I know. Then I left the room. Not in anger, not in retreat, but in closure. The following week, I looked at apartments. I didn't tell her. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because it wasn't about her anymore. It was about air, space, peace, the kind you can only build from the ground up when the foundation you once stood on had long since rotted away. One of the places I visited was modest, a studio above a bookstore, hardwood floors, a window that caught the morning light just right. No echo of raised voices, no ghosts of past compromises, just possibility. I signed the lease that afternoon. That night, I walked through the house one last time. Not packing, not rushing, just acknowledging. The rooms that once held laughter now only held echoes. The framed photos on the walls were already fading in my mind. Not painful, just distant. Like postcards from a city you once lived in, but no longer called home. When I returned to the guest room, I began folding my clothes. I didn't take everything, just what I needed. The rest would come later, or maybe not at all. She stood in the doorway, watching, not pleading, not crying, just watching. "You're moving out," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Tomorrow." She crossed her arms. "Are you sure?" There it was, the last attempt, not to hold me back, but to hold on to something familiar, even if it had already slipped through her fingers. "I was sure the night you called my love the bare minimum," I said, calm as the evening breeze drifting through the window. She looked down. No defense, no retort, just silence. "I don't hate you," I added, "and that's why I'm leaving now. Not later. I don't want to stay long enough for that to change." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing the truth in pieces, like glass sinking into sand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and I believed her. But not all apologies need acceptance. Some are just acknowledgments of a lesson finally learned too late. I left the next morning before the sun had risen. As I closed the front door behind me, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken either. I felt aligned, like something inside had finally clicked back into place after years of silent misalignment. I wasn't walking away from her. I was walking toward myself. There's a particular peace in knowing you gave your best, not just once, but consistently, and still chose to walk away when your best was belittled. That peace doesn't roar. It doesn't parade. It simply whispers, "You did the right thing." I never looked back at the house. Not once. I didn't need to, because when something breaks without apology, it leaves scars. But when something breaks and both people learn, it leaves wisdom. I wasn't taking revenge. I was taking responsibility. And that was the loudest love letter I could ever write to the man I almost forgot I was becoming. It's strange how quiet freedom is. No parade, no anthem, no fireworks. Just breathe. Clean, undemanding breath. That was the first thing I noticed the morning I woke up in my new apartment. The sunlight cut across the wooden floor in perfect lines, like the start of a new page. There were no unanswered questions echoing off the walls. No half-hearted sighs from the other room. Just coffee brewing, a record playing low, and the subtle recognition that I had survived something. Not war exactly, but a slow erosion of self. And now I was whole again. Wholeness doesn't mean happiness all the time. Some days the grief of what could have been lingers like fog over a field. But even that grief, when met with stillness, becomes wisdom. Not the kind that shouts lessons in your face, but the kind that places a firm hand on your shoulder and simply says, "You're better now." I hadn't spoken to her since I left. There were messages, a few, polite, measured. No desperation this time, only formality. She returned my books, left a box of old photos at my door. I never opened it. I didn't need memories filtered through regret. What mattered wasn't the past we'd built. It was the future I was finally free to build without her. I remember sitting on the balcony one night, staring at the street below. People walked with purpose. Couples laughed. The world kept turning, and it hit me. No one was coming to rescue me from the weight of what I'd endured, but I had rescued myself. That counted for something. No, it counted for everything. When your heart breaks in silence, not from one grand betrayal, but 1,000 tiny dismissals, You don't rebuild it with rage. You rebuild it with intention. You decide day by day to show up for yourself the way no one else did. That's what I had been doing, showing up. I started reading again, not just headlines or deadlines, real books. I took walks without my phone. I cooked meals that only I would eat and poured wine without needing a second glass. And every single act whispered the same truth. I'm still here, and that's enough. Some of my friends didn't understand. They thought I should have fought harder, compromised more, begged longer. But they weren't there when she laughed at my efforts. They didn't sit through years of being made to feel like the bare minimum. They only saw the exit, not the miles of silent endurance that came before it. Let them wonder. I've learned that not every ending needs to be justified. Some things simply need to end, and some people are better loved from a distance, or not at all. Months passed. One evening, while sorting through mail, I came across a letter. Not from her, but from myself. I had written it during the last few days in the house, tucked it into my journal, and forgotten. The handwriting was tired. The tone was raw. If you're reading this, it means you did it. You left. You chose yourself. And even if it still hurts, know this. You are no longer begging for space in someone's heart. You are building a life where you are the center, not an afterthought. Don't look back. Not with bitterness, not even with longing. Look forward. There's still joy ahead. Go find it. I smiled. I folded the letter and put it back where it belonged. Not in a frame, not on a pedestal, but in the past. A few weeks later, I ran into her by chance at a bookstore. Her hair was shorter, her eyes softer. She looked calm. We exchanged a glance. Nothing more. No words, no need. We had already said everything that mattered. In silence, in space, in the way we let go without trying to claw back what had already dissolved. She walked one way, I walked the other. No closure, just peace. These days, people ask me if I'm open to love again, and the answer's always the same. I never close the door. I just learned to lock it behind those who slam it. Love, when it returns, will knock gently. It will not mock. It will not measure. It will not treat effort as currency or attention as debt. Until then, I am enough. More than the bare minimum. I am the full measure of growth, of stillness, of self-worth rebuilt from ruin. And in that knowledge, I have found something even more sacred than love. I have found peace. If this story resonated with you, don't just keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.